Hey guys, Stockaholics, thank you guys for being here today. In the beginning of my videos, I have a bump that says Contrarian Investing. Not all of my views are contrarian ones, but I think that the topic that I'm talking about today is largely a dissent from normal opinions. The unpopular opinion I'll be talking about today is my broad macro outlook on a lot of things, and that is that inflation and supply chains are getting better and that they are not getting worse. I'd also like to mention that I think a lot of people who may share my view might decide that the optimal strategy is to be fully uninvested in the stock market. And I don't go to that extreme either. Although I believe in disinflation and perhaps at some point in the year or two down the road, deflation, that doesn't affect my decision to be invested in the stock market. I believe that the long-term most successful strategy is to largely be invested, regardless of your views. So I do not allow my views to influence my broad investing strategy. Now, it does affect my opinion on where I am involved to invest, especially when I'm thinking about a lot of cyclical names that are highly affected by the concepts I'll be talking about in this video. There are cycles in a lot of things. In elementary school, we learned about something called the water cycle. In middle school, you may learn about in science about something called carbon cycles and other kinds of cycles. When we're thinking about politics, there's often on this channel I mentioned something called a pendulum. When things go too far one way, they often tend to swing the other. There's a political cycle. When we are talking about economics, there are also economic cycles. And within industries, there are also cycles. I think a lot of people, and this is the caption that I've placed here, they assume that conditions and cycles will not change. And I think that the reason for that is that for a lot of people, they don't recognize cycles as cycles. They see them as static conditions that will continue indefinitely. I'll give you guys an example. For the average person, if they go to the gas pump and they see that the price is $4 or $5 a gallon. I live in Hawaii, and that's we're paying 4 something a gallon now. California, they're paying like $5.50 a gallon. A lot of people, when they see these prices, they say they maybe they blame some politicians or greedy capitalists or whatever. And by the way, that might push the political pendulum one another way. But they don't realize that there are cycles within the oil industry as well. When prices get too low, it causes underinvestment. And when prices get very high, it causes, generally speaking, overinvestment, which causes prices to go back down, right? People see those high prices, they say, hey, this looks bad. They can't imagine those conditions getting better. The same is true too on the other side. Although I think when you think about low gas prices, people don't think about those things anymore. They think about other things. But let's say we're talking about, for example, containership stocks. I get a lot of flack when I talk about this and a negative view on it. They see that, because containership stocks are earning a lot of money now, because there are a lot of conditions that cause container ships to earn tremendous earnings right now, that will continue into the near future, where in reality, everything is a cycle, including those container ship stocks, right? So I wanted to make the point that I'm never going to permanently be bearish on anything. I'm never going to be permanently be bullish on anything when we're talking about cycles or cyclical industries in general. Sometimes I play this video game, which you can see on my screen, called CSGO. In this game, there is a very interesting thing that I noticed that I think strongly represents what we are beginning to see in the real world economy. Now, before I lose you, let me explain. In this game, there are goods that you can purchase. Now, these goods are based on real world dollars. So you can go and purchase what you can see here in this gentleman's hand, fancy artwork or skins for US dollars. And in the game that these have value. I'm not suggesting that everybody in this watching this video go out and purchase these skins because they have perhaps they may go up in value in the future. They might, I don't know, but that's not what I'm saying. I think eventually they're going to be worthless because, as all video games do, eventually they lose popularity and they kind of die. And which means that if you're spending large amounts of money on these skins, eventually those will end up to be worthless too. But there is some interesting patterns that we can determine from this game, I believe, in terms of marginal spending. So there are patterns that you can see in terms of the average gamer, I guess, over the past 12, 18 months in this game that mirror, which I'll back up with some real economic data as well, that mirror what's going on in the real world economy. And when I noticed this, I just thought it was super fascinating and I wanted to share it. All right, I am within the CSGO game right now. And what we're looking at here is a collection of fantastic cases within my personal inventory. I didn't pay for any of these. The way that I acquired these cases is that you play the game for a fixed amount of time. Every week you get one of these randomly, okay? And as you can see with the mouse that I'm hovering over, there is a certain rarity of skins, these valuable artworks that can drop within this case if you pay the company that makes this game a fixed $2.50 or something like that to open one of these cases. Okay. Now, what I thought was very interesting that I wanted to show you guys with this is in terms of marginal spending. So if we think of the average player who's playing this game, well, I would suggest that they're somewhere in their 20s, the average age. There's going to be a certain percentage of kids that play this game, and then there's going to be a certain percentage of people that are older. CSGO has been around for a while, both in the predecessor to this game itself and this game, okay? It hasn't been waning in popularity either, so there are a lot of people who have discretionary spending available to them. Now, I wanted to show you a particular pattern. And what's awesome about this game is you have pricing data for every digital item within this game, okay? What we're looking at here is something that I think pronounces the pattern that I wanted to show you guys, called the glove case, okay? Now, if you look at the beginning of these cases that drop in the game, they're always worth a tremendous amount of money relative to a lot of where a lot of cases trade in the beginning, because there is a lot of demand initially for these cases. You know, there's a brand new amount of skins that are released to the community via one of these cases, and people want to pay a lot for them because there's a novelty to them, whatever, right? At the same time, there is a very, very, very fixed supply because they drop at random and you can only get, you know, one of these cases a week, right? So the price in the beginning, very high. That rapidly changes. This is a pattern you see with every one of these cases where they rapidly drop, where supply eventually catches up, where they continue to drop every single week, and demand starts to wane as the initial novelty wears off, where they reach this bare minimum price of 3 cents a piece. Now, the pattern that I wanted to share with you guys that was very interesting to me is that not that they tend to increase, that happens with all the cases, but the rate at which a lot of these increases have occurred within a lot of these cases over the last year. Now, what tends to happen is, although they eventually reach their bare minimum, they eventually stop dropping in circulation. There's a new case that comes out, and eventually these cases, the supply is no more. They can no longer add supply, so it becomes a finite resource, I guess, in the game, right? What happens is that, you know, more and more there might be people that want to open these cases, they're removed from circulation, and, you know, maybe some of these people quit the game who have these cases in their inventory, forget about it. There's people who are cheaters in the game, they have these cases in their inventory, so they get banned, those cases get removed from circulation. Eventually, supply starts to match demand, and then what that causes is prices to go up, and this happens with all cases. But like I mentioned, you can really see this accelerating in a lot of these cases, and what we're looking at is this acceleration. So With this particular case, it was worth about 22 cents when the Cerveza first started in 2020. And it began to accelerate, in my opinion, largely because number one, there was a lot of people staying at home playing this kind of game. But more importantly, there was a lot of demand via stimulus. So you can imagine all of these gamers at home being inundated with stimulus checks. What a lot of people do with money, well, they spend it. And if they have an excess amount of money available to them, they spend it on dumb excess things, kind of like these skins, okay? Now, what's really interesting is when you can really see these accelerate. The last stimulus check, I believe, was mid-April in 2021, and it was the largest one. It was about 2,000. And with this particular case, you can see this price going astronomical. It basically doubled within a few month time period. What is fascinating, though, is that eventually it reached a peak, and since then has been in a downtrend. What is really interesting is that with most cases, you do not really see these kinds of downtrends, okay? There's not been a period where cases ever just continuously drop like this, at least with the cases I have been looking at. And if you look at this over the past month, what this is suggesting is that retail spending is going off of a cliff. There's a lot less demand for excess spending outside of things that are needed for everyday living for the vast majority of retail people out there, okay? And I'm going to explain a little bit more about this via some legitimate economic ideas. What's very interesting to me is just like we see this pattern where we see an acceleration in the price of these cases, and how I see that is in terms of marginal consumer spending. We also see the same pattern in terms of retail sales. And by the way, you know, when I made my Containership video a few months back, you know, people gave me a lot of flack for this, but we are beginning to see retail sales fall over. And this is another way that we can think of consumer spending on goods. When Cerveza first started, there was lockdowns. People were scared. They didn't have a lot of extra money. There was a lot of panic. People fled to the dollar, and they also didn't spend as much on retail goods, right? Now, eventually people were stuck at home. They were also receiving unemployment benefits, additional expanded unemployment benefits, and they also received stimulus checks. So they couldn't necessarily spend these in a lot of the ways that they could traditionally, and they were also incentivized to spend them because they had a lot of excess income. So what did they do? They bought a lot of goods either through Amazon or, and especially what we saw in the summer months last year, where they began to spend those in retail sales and especially in big box stores as well. Now, that spending through all of this excess income that people had not went from well below the mean to well above the mean as well, right? And what you notice is that we're a few months after that final stimulus check hit the market, that these sales began to roll over. And what we're also beginning to see is that those unemployment benefits are now over. We are noticing that the mortgage moratoriums are now over. We're noticing that rental moratoriums are now over. And so to me, it seems only logical that instead of thinking about this linearly, we should think about it in terms of cycle. Where is this cycle most likely to head? Back to the mean. My view is that there will be a time in the very near future that many goods will drop dramatically in price. What we just saw was kind of the demand side of that picture, right? There's also a supply side of that picture, okay? What we're looking at is something called the Bullwhip Effect. The Bullwhip Effect is something like this. So let's say there is a normal supply chain, okay? Something happens and there is an increase in demand. So the customers, maybe perhaps they had stimulus, perhaps they were locked down at home. they had more demand than usual. So they went to retailers, either Amazon or Walmart or wherever, and they purchased some more goods, right? By the way, many of which were durable ones, so they may not need these goods anymore after having purchased them, right? But the retailer, noticing an increase in the demand for their goods, notice that, okay, whoa, we're kind of running low on XYZ items. They go to the distributor and they order more. That maybe let's say before they would order 100 of a widget. When they go next time to order from their distributor, maybe they're ordering 200, anticipating that that demand will continue. The distributor notices that, oh wow, all my retailers are ordering a lot more of these products. Same thing, instead of having a supply of what X amount of widgets, maybe they need to double that to match retail demand. Then they go to the manufacturer and they order even more. Same thing happens over here, right? The manufacturer says, whoa, there's a big demand for all of these items that was pretty static before, but now is increasing rapidly. I need to go out and purchase more commodities to produce these things, right? So when we see it is a temporary increase in demand, the supply chain adjusts. It tries to accommodate that demand, but it assumes that that increase in demand is permanent. You know, I was talking about that cycle. A lot of people get fixed in and misinterpret a lot of the data. I'll give you an example of one of the companies, by the way, which I am invested in that did just that, was A2 Milk. When the lockdowns first started, the company noticed that there was a rapid increase in milk purchases. People were hoarding, they were stocking up on this stuff, being very scared of the lockdowns and the cerveza, right? Now, the company misinterpreted that because beforehand, they had already seen rapid growth in their company, and they didn't recognize that this was a temporary phenomenon. This is happening not just within this company, but all across supply chains. And this temporary phenomenon is coming to an end, right? What happens when the customer no longer has stimulus money? What happens when the customer no longer has expanded unemployment benefits? What happens when fuel costs have risen dramatically? What happens when commodity costs have risen dramatically? What happens when shipping costs have risen dramatically? What happens when everything costs have risen dramatically? And there are no longer the conditions that previously allowed this customer to be purchasing all of these goods, right? The customer, who, by the way, a lot of these goods were durable, no longer needs them. And also the prices of a lot of these goods have gone up and the customer has less money, right? So what happens is the manufacturers, misinterpreting that demand, order too many commodities, they produce too many things. And you know what? The distributor ends up calling them and say, hey, you know what? We don't need this stuff anymore. Our inventory is full. In fact, we have an oversupply of inventory. Once those supply disruptions get fixed, the same thing happens to the retailer. The retailer says, hey, you know what, Mr. Distributor, although we were ordering more of that widget before, we're noticing that, you know, in fact, there's actually less demand for this widget now. We're going to have to cut that back. And at the same time, you know, the retailers' shelves are full, their warehouses are full. And in some cases, what we've seen with a lot of big box retailers, they've doubled their orders, they tripled their orders just because of the bottlenecks in the supply chain, right? So what's going to happen when all of these goods eventually make it to where they need to go? I think that you have a case where you're going to see significant lower prices for a lot of goods. Not all goods, but a lot of them, okay? The cost of goods and container shipping costs will drop. The demand side, political appetite, by the way, for stimulus is gone. We don't hear about that anymore. Even the party that I guess is famous for having spent tremendous amounts of money, even though both parties do that. Neither party is interested in this anymore. Political appetite for extended unemployment benefits are gone, right? The politicians, the mainstream, everybody's starting to realize, hey, you know, Joe is sitting at home collecting these benefits when we have, there's plenty of jobs available, right? When you have 10 people applying to a restaurant job, and only one person showing up to an interview, it probably shows you there's something wrong in terms of incentives and unemployment benefits, right? People are abusing the system. Mortgage moratoriums, gone. What, when people had the option of spending or not paying their mortgage, and maybe some people just justifiably weren't able to make those payments, those are gone, right? And by the way, I think that's why there's another reason you're going to see an increase in supply of housing in the near future, because some percentage of those people are going to be foreclosed upon, right? Rental moratoriums are gone. So we're thinking about it from Wojak or the average Joe, right? He's going to have to start paying his rent. There's a certain, not, and this isn't everybody, but there's a percentage of the population that's been abusing their landlords. They have saying, I can't pay you, sir. And they've been able to play the system and not get kicked out, right? They have to now pay their rents, right? And other spending options are increasingly available. What that means is, when we were stuck at home the past year, where people were spending a lot more goods on goods, now there's the option to spend on services, right? So let's say you don't want to spend money on Amazon anymore. Maybe you go to Disneyland if you have excess income, right? So if you have the availability to be spending on marginal income, you can do that on other things now, right? And there's also the supply side. Producers are still overproducing. Eventually, that's going to catch up. That's going to work its way through the supply chain, despite popular opinion. And there will be a flood of goods in many economies. Now, I'm not saying that there's not going to be further disruptions, okay? I think that there is. There are still a lot of cerveza responses in the world. But, like I've said down here, another pattern we're noticing is that there's a lot of places in the world that people are fed up. They're sick of it, right? United States, when you turn on YouTube, you see people rioting in Italy. I've seen some riots in Australia. I've seen riots everywhere. People have had enough, okay? So the probability that it continues versus the probability that that political pendulum swings the other way, my opinion is more probable that that thing changes, right? Another thing we're noticing in where you see the biggest bottlenecks is not in terms of supply of ships, despite popular opinion, but in terms of ports and in terms of on-land trucking and things like that, right? Some of these ports are quietly extending working hours. I've read a few articles where they're trying to alleviate these bottlenecks by unloading ships at night. And we think about the undersupply of trucking. Let's say that there were certain people who were stuck on unemployment benefits before, right? Who are now probably going to re-enter the workforce. Maybe some percentage of those people were truckers. Maybe noticing that there is a huge demand for these truckers, maybe some percentage of those people will become truckers, right? So the cycles, they inevitably go one way and then they go the other, okay? Now there's some questions that arise in my mind. We're thinking about all of these patterns in terms of all kinds of different things, okay? I made a video a few weeks ago where I was talking about something called the wealth effect, which I learned through some of the comments below. The way I defined that was called wind tilting, right? Well, a lot of people, when their assets have increased in value over the last year, that has led to even more increased demand, right? The stock market has gone up. For myself, when I noticed that I was making a tremendous amount of money with my investments, I increased my discretionary spending on dumb things, right? At what point, when the stock market, maybe has a little bit of a dip, at what point does that cause people to decrease spending even more, right? When I think about that, I think of a lot of the assets, just like the CSGO cases, that are heavily retail based, right? Your average Joe and Jane buying them or owning them. And what really comes to my mind are things like Bitcoin, right? Over the last year, just like we saw a pattern with the stimulus in terms of CSGO cases, you can make the case much the same way with Bitcoin. So I wonder what's really going to happen to this. I think personally, by the way, I had a negative view on Bitcoin kind of maybe 6 months ago. I've since changed my mind a lot on a lot of these specific kinds of crypto since I've learned a little bit more about it. But I will say that I'm nowhere near a buying level because of my view on my macro view. I think that there's a tremendous downward pressure on assets like Bitcoin, speculative stocks, and maybe even the stock market in general. Okay, but again, I don't let this view change my overall investment decision. I also think about, like with all of these things changing, is there really going to be a labor shortage? I know that it's now, there exists one, but the chance that something like that continues, it's hard for me to see that, right? Will truckers come back to work? Something I mentioned with the supply side a second ago, to work, or will more people become truckers as there's a need for these kinds of things to alleviate these supply chains? Again, that's something a lot of people don't think about, is that human beings, supply chains, nations, we all have the ability to adapt to different situations, right? And that's what's great about capitalism. When prices get to a certain level, it incentivizes conditions to change because it attracts people to those professions and to those bottlenecks to fix those kinds of things, right? The other thing too, right? When we think about the lack of stimulus, the lack of unemployment benefits, with people stuck at home, with people now having to return to the workforce to afford different things, are they really going to be able to afford a lot of the things that have gone up tremendously in price? And you think about energy costs. Again, when I was a year ago, gallon of gas, $2.50. Now it's $4, right? And when you think about these pinches when people actually need to return to the workforce too, right? The marginal spending, whether it's CSGO skins or whatever, in goods, especially durable goods, when they've already purchased them, are they going to continue to purchase them as those prices go up, and their savings, etc., is going down? And services, when we have more options for spending just beyond just goods as economies are opening, right? The other side of this too, one of the questions I think about is, one of the phenomena we've seen is, like, at least in my area and a lot of other places, if you go outside and you look at like McDonald's, these fast food joints, you almost all of them, they have this sign that says bonus, come and work, right? My mind is, when you think about the average person's income without all this stimulus, etc., or maybe not their income, their spending, their available spending having to diminish, can employers really afford to pay significantly higher wages to sustain this, in my opinion, previously high levels of artificial consumption? Maybe, I don't know. That's, we'll see, I guess. Yeah. And then the last one, like I mentioned, will ports and supply chains adapt further? I think that they will. I think that at least there's a high probability of that happening. Now, for all of these reasons is why I'm bearish on containership stocks. I am bearish on a lot of commodities that already have inflated in price. Well, when supply chains are likely to become alleviated, and likewise when consumers can no longer afford elevated prices, it inevitably causes cycles to revert back to means. Or when we see the bullwhip effect come into full swing, you may even see a lot of these things go below the mean, right? And that's the beauty of cycles, right? Eventually, when all of these the stocks correlated with these different assets go way lower, I'm going to be back in there. When I see that there is tremendous pessimism in the containership market and there's very high scrapping taking place, I'll be back in there too. Because inevitably what always happens is that's, even though this is what's defining this economic cycle, is supply chain disruptions and economic stimulus, there'll be new conditions that define the next one. And even though history doesn't repeat, cycles do. They're a little different each time, but they are inevitably, they're still the same kinds of cycles. I'll see you guys soon.